The morning Sylvia found the second phone, she was looking for a pen, that was all, a pen. She needed to sign a birthday card for her mother, and she thought maybe Reeve had left one in the kitchen drawer. The messy one, the one they always said they'd clean out someday but never did. She pulled it open, rummaged past batteries and takeout menus, and a tape measure nobody ever used, and there it was. Not a pen, a phone, black, slim, no case. She didn't even recognize it at first. She thought it was an old model he'd forgotten to trade in, then it lit up, a text. No name saved, just a number. And the message said, "Last night was perfect, I can still smell you on me." Sylvia stood in her own kitchen in her bare feet on a Tuesday morning, holding a birthday card for her mother in one hand and her husband's secret life in the other. She was 34 years old, 11 weeks pregnant, and every plan she had ever made for herself, the house, the nursery, the future she had quietly, carefully built, collapsed in the time it took to read 11 words. People always say they would know, that they'd have felt something shift, some warning, some cooling in the air between them. Sylvia had believed that too once, but the truth was, she hadn't felt a thing. Reeve Callahan had been attentive. He'd rubbed her back when the nausea got bad. He'd gone with her to the first 2 prenatal appointments, holding her hand in the waiting room, asking the doctor questions that made Sylvia think, this man is going to be a good father. She had thought that. Sitting right there in a paper gown on a crinkly exam table, she had looked at him and felt safe. She set the phone back in the drawer. She closed it. She went to work. She didn't say anything that night, or the night after. She made dinner and watched him eat it and smiled when he kissed her forehead before bed. And she thought, very clearly, I need to know everything before I say a single word. Sylvia worked in estate law. She knew better than most people that how you enter a negotiation determines how you leave it. You don't show your hand. You don't move until you understand the full board. And so she waited and she watched, and she started to notice things she had explained away for months. The second phone disappeared from the drawer 2 days later. He must have moved it. She didn't let herself react. Instead, she started paying attention differently. Not with the anxious, hopeful attention of a woman who loves her husband and wants to believe the best, but with the cool, analytical attention of someone building a file. She noticed the nights he showered as soon as he got home instead of after dinner. She noticed the new gym bag he'd bought in March, which struck her as strange because Reeve had never once set foot in a gym voluntarily. She noticed that he had started locking his car, something he never used to do, not in their own driveway. She noticed that his sister Pamela, who used to text Sylvia directly, had gone quiet, had stopped the little check-ins, the memes, the invitations to brunch. Sylvia noticed all of it, and she filed it away. Her doctor had ordered extra monitoring because of some minor blood work irregularities. Nothing alarming, but worth watching. At her 12-week appointment, she sat alone in the waiting room because Reeve said he had a client call he couldn't reschedule. The ultrasound technician turned the screen so Sylvia could see the heartbeat, that small, fierce flutter on the monitor, and Sylvia pressed her lips together and did not cry. She was going to be okay. She just had to get through this quietly. It was Sylvia's own accountant who broke things open, not on purpose, not because anyone asked her to. Lorraine Purcell had been doing Sylvia's taxes for 6 years. She was a practical, unhurried woman who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and believed deeply in documentation. She called Sylvia on a Wednesday afternoon and said, without preamble, "Sylvia, I need you to come in. There are some things I'm seeing in the joint accounts that I think you need to look at yourself." Sylvia came in that Friday. She sat across from Lorraine's desk and went through 3 years of financial records, and what she found was this. Reeve had been siphoning money. Not enormous sums at once. Nothing that would trigger a flag or warrant a call from the bank. Small transfers. Recurring payments to a holding company she'd never heard of. A storage unit she didn't know existed. A lease deposit on an apartment in Midtown, paid 8 months ago, around the same time Sylvia had first noticed the gym bag. There was a name attached to the holding company. She had Lorraine look it up while she sat right there. Tara Bellows, 27 years old, a junior marketing associate at the firm where Reeve had done consulting work the previous year. Sylvia looked at that name for a long time. Then she thanked Lorraine, paid her invoice, and drove home. She sat in the car in her own driveway for 20 minutes. She thought about the nursery they'd started painting, that soft green color she'd spent 3 weekends choosing. She thought about what it had cost her to get here, not just financially, though she had brought considerably more into this marriage than Reeve ever had. She thought about the years she had worked 70-hour weeks, building her practice, the partnership she'd made senior at 31, the money she'd used to get Reeve's consulting business off the ground when he was floundering. She thought about all of it, and then she thought about an 11-word text message, and a gym bag and a lease deposit on an apartment in Midtown, and she made a decision. She was not going to walk into that house and confront him. Not yet. Not until she had everything. She called her college roommate, Bridget, that same night from the grocery store parking lot. On her own phone, her personal one, the one she paid for herself from an account Reeve didn't know about, which in retrospect felt like the only smart thing she'd ever done. Bridget said, "Tell me what you need." Sylvia said, "I need you to remember that I'm a lawyer. I know you're a lawyer. Then trust me when I say I have a plan." She did have a plan. It came to her fully formed, the way the best legal strategies sometimes did, not from panic but from clarity. She understood, with cold precision, what Reeve was doing. He was positioning. He had been for months. The transfers, the apartment, the secrecy, this was a man preparing for something. Either he was building a separate life to run to, or he was preparing to leave on terms he controlled. Either way, Sylvia had no intention of being the one caught off guard. She retained a family law attorney the following Monday, a woman named Caroline Park, known in their professional circles for being both ruthless and methodical. Sylvia explained everything. Caroline listened without interrupting. Then she said, "You've already done most of the hard work. Now we document the rest." Over the next 6 weeks, while Sylvia went home every evening and cooked dinner and asked Reeve about his day and laughed at his jokes, she was building a case. Every transfer, every payment, every record of the apartment and the holding company, every piece of financial evidence Lorraine could pull. She had her own financial advisor quietly begin restructuring her personal assets. She said nothing at dinner. She smiled. She let Reeve put his hand on her stomach when the baby kicked for the first time, and she watched his face do something complicated, guilty, tender, cowardly all at once. And she filed that away too. She was 17 weeks along when she finally asked the question she'd been holding for 2 months. She waited until a Sunday morning when Reeve was relaxed, coffee in hand, scrolling through something on his tablet. She came and sat across from him at the kitchen table. She set her own coffee down, and she said, very quietly, "How long have you been with Tara Bellows?" The color left his face. He said nothing for 3 full seconds, which was long enough. Then he said her name, Sylvia, in a voice that was already making excuses, already rearranging the story into something he could live with. She held up one hand. "I don't need you to explain. I need you to understand something. I know about the holding company. I know about the apartment. I know about the transfers going back 31 months. My attorney already has copies of everything." She paused. "I'm asking you one question, and I need you to answer it honestly, because it's the only honest thing I'm going to ask you for." She looked at him directly. "Did you want me to find out, or were you planning to keep going until you'd taken everything?" He looked at his coffee cup. He looked at the table. He looked for one terrible second like he might actually cry. "I didn't mean for it. That's not what I asked." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know." It was, in a strange way, the most honest answer he'd given her in years. She nodded. She stood up. She said, "Okay. My attorney will be in touch with yours by the end of the week. I'd like you to stay somewhere else starting tonight." He started to say something. She went upstairs. She thought that would be the hardest part. She was wrong. The hardest part was what happened 2 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon, when her doctor called her back into the office not for her scheduled appointment, but because something in her latest blood work needed to be discussed in person. Sylvia sat in the familiar exam room, the one with the framed poster of a lighthouse above the sink, and her OB, a calm, careful woman named Dr. Vasquez, told her that her blood pressure had been escalating and that combined with some protein in her urine, the pattern was consistent with early-stage preeclampsia. "It's manageable," Dr. Vasquez said, but I want to be clear that it requires monitoring. If it progresses, we may need to make decisions earlier than expected." Sylvia asked all the right questions. She wrote things down. She thanked Dr. Vasquez and walked out to her car. Then she sat in the parking garage and understood, perhaps for the first time, that she was doing all of this alone. Not in the self-pitying way. She was not a woman who had much patience for self-pity, but in the plain, factual way. There was no one to call from that parking garage who would come right now. Bridget was in Seattle. Her mother was managing her own health. And the person who was supposed to be her partner had been spending her money on an apartment in Midtown for the woman he had preferred instead. She allowed herself to feel that for exactly as long as it took to drive out of the garage and merge onto the highway. Then she called her mother. She told her about the preeclampsia, not to worry her, but because her mother was the kind of woman who needed to know things, who felt the exclusion of information as a specific wound. Her mother said, "I'm coming up next weekend." Sylvia said, "You don't have to." Her mother said, "I didn't say I had to." Her mother came. She stayed for 10 days. She stocked the refrigerator and drove Sylvia to 2 appointments and slept in the guest room. And she never once said, "I told you so," which Sylvia had braced for and which never came. What her mother said instead on the last night before she flew home, sitting at the kitchen table with decaf tea, was, "You built a good life here, Syl. It's still yours." Sylvia looked at her mother across the table. Her mother was 62 and had been divorced once and widowed once and had raised Sylvia largely on her own. And she said things like that with a weight that only comes from having actually survived things. "I know," Sylvia said. "I just want to make sure you know," her mother said. The divorce proceedings moved with the grinding, expensive slowness of all things legal, which Sylvia understood professionally even when she resented it personally. Reeve's attorney made the expected arguments. Reeve himself made the expected gestures, a phone call in the second week, ostensibly to check on the baby, during which he said things like, "I still care about you, and this doesn't have to be adversarial." Sylvia listened with the phone held loosely, as though it were a document she was reviewing, and when he finished she said, "My attorney is the right person to talk to about that," and ended the call. He tried once more a week later. He showed up at the door with flowers, grocery store flowers, she noticed, not even from a florist, which was such a specific Reeve detail that she almost laughed, and he said he wanted to talk, that Tara was not who he wanted, that he'd made a terrible mistake. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. She thought about 31 months. She thought about the holding company. She thought about the way he'd looked at the kitchen table and said I don't know when she'd asked if he'd planned to take everything. She said, "I hope you find what you're looking for, Reeve. I really do, but I'm not it." She closed the door. She was 23 weeks along when the news reached her through someone who knew someone. Tara Bellows had ended things. The apartment in Midtown was now just Reeve's apartment. Whatever he'd promised Tara, however he'd described the situation, something had not held. Sylvia learned this at a lunch with a colleague and felt nothing specific. Maybe a small, complicated satisfaction, less about Tara and more about the simple confirmation that Reeve was exactly who she'd finally understood him to be. A man who made promises as needed and kept them as convenient. Tara wasn't a villain in this story exactly. She was someone who had believed him, the same way Sylvia once had. And she had found out in her own time, in her own way, the same way Sylvia had. Probably alone, probably standing somewhere ordinary, probably thinking, oh, she felt a brief, strange kinship with someone she'd never met. She ordered the salad and talked about depositions. The baby came early, not dramatically early, not in the way that requires a NICU and years of held breath, but early enough. 36 weeks, on a Tuesday night in November, when Sylvia's blood pressure climbed into territory that Dr. Vasquez had told her to take seriously. Sylvia called her mother from the hospital, because that was who she called now. Her mother said she was on her way. Sylvia said the flight was too long. Her mother said she was already at the airport. The labor was not what she'd imagined. Very little of the past year had been what she'd imagined. It was long and exhausting, and there were moments, particularly somewhere in hour 11, when she thought, with a kind of gray, flat clarity, I cannot do this. And then she did it anyway, the way she had done everything else this year, because she was the only option available, and because the alternative was unthinkable. Dr. Vasquez was there. So was a labor nurse named Amara, who had warm hands and an economy of words that Sylvia appreciated deeply. Amara did not say, "You've got this," or "Almost there, Mama." She just said, when it mattered, "Breathe, I'm right here," which was exactly the right thing to say. Her mother arrived 40 minutes too late and was crying in the hallway when Sylvia's daughter entered the world at 4:17 in the morning, 6 pounds even, and screaming with a volume that seemed excessive and perfect. They put the baby on Sylvia's chest. Sylvia had read about this moment. She'd read about the overwhelming rush of it, the primal recognition, the way everything else falls away. And it was like that. But it was also quieter than she'd expected. It was less explosion and more revelation, the steady, gradual understanding that she was looking at someone entirely new, someone she would spend the rest of her life trying to deserve. She thought stupidly about the green nursery wall, the color she'd spent 3 weekends choosing. She had chosen a good color. Reeve found out about the birth through her voicemail. She'd left one, brief, factual, because despite everything she believed he had the right to know. He called back 4 times in the following 2 hours. She was asleep. When she finally spoke to him the next morning, she told him the baby's name, told him she was healthy, told him that his attorney and her attorney would discuss visitation arrangements. And then she said goodbye and hung up and looked at her daughter asleep in the hospital bassinet. Her daughter's name was Wren, not after anyone, not for any particular reason, except that it was simple and strong, and Sylvia had said it out loud in the parking garage one afternoon, and the baby had moved, which she knew was coincidence, but which she chose to take as an opinion. Her mother held Wren for 3 hours that first morning and said almost nothing, which was the most articulate her mother had ever been. The settlement was finalized when Wren was 6 weeks old. Caroline Park was, as advertised, both ruthless and methodical. What Reeve had moved during those 31 months was recouped with interest. The apartment lease ended. The holding company dissolved. He retained his consulting business because Sylvia had not wanted it. She'd never wanted it, had only funded it because she believed in him, which was its own kind of loss. He had agreed to the custody arrangement Caroline had proposed. Sylvia expected a fight. There wasn't one, which told her something she didn't have the energy to analyze. She sat in Caroline's office and signed her name 6 times. And when it was done, Caroline said, "You handled this better than most." Sylvia said, "I had good documentation." Caroline almost smiled. That too. She didn't think about Reeve much after that. She thought about Wren constantly, obsessively, the way she thought about a brief she needed to get right. Checking, rechecking, making sure she hadn't missed anything. She thought about the pediatrician appointments and the feedings schedule, and the small question of whether the noise machine should be rain or white noise. Rain, ultimately, because Wren seemed to sleep better, and Sylvia had decided that her daughter's preferences mattered from the start. She went back to work at 10 weeks because she had cases that needed her, and also because she needed work the way she'd always needed it, not as escape, but as ground. Something solid under her feet. She'd hired a nanny, a steady woman named Geraldine, who Sylvia had interviewed 4 times and had run a full background check on, and who within the first week had correctly identified that Wren did not like to be rocked horizontally, but would tolerate being walked in a tight figure 8. Sylvia had found this information both practical and oddly moving. Life, it turned out, kept going, even the bad parts, also the good ones. She met Jonah Callister in the spring, at the kind of networking event she usually talked herself out of attending. He was a structural engineer, which seemed about as far from estate law as a profession could get, and he was there because a mutual colleague had also talked him into attending, and he was standing near the drinks table with the expression of someone mentally calculating how long they had to stay before leaving was acceptable. She recognized the expression because she was wearing it. She said, 20 more minutes feels like the minimum, doesn't it? He looked over. He said, I was thinking 15, but I'm willing to negotiate. They talked for 45 minutes and then left at the same time and stood outside on the sidewalk in the April evening and kept talking because the conversation had that quality of not being finished yet. He was 38. He had grown up in Ohio, gone to school in Michigan, landed in the city for a project that turned into a life. He was earnest in a way that she hadn't expected to find interesting but did. He asked her questions and then actually listened to the answers. She noticed this specifically because she was, by training, attuned to when people were simply waiting for their turn to speak, and Jonah was not doing that. She told him she had a 5-month-old. He said, "What's her name?" "Wren, that's a good name," he said, without pause, without the complicated half-second of recalibration she'd come to expect from people when she mentioned Wren, as if they were rapidly adjusting for the thing that was implied about her life. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Yes, it is." She gave him her number. She was not nervous about it. She had learned, in the past year, to have a fairly clear sense of what she could handle and what she could not, and what she thought she might be able to handle. Now was this. A conversation that wasn't finished. A person who listened. Something slow and voluntary and built on honest ground. They got coffee the following week. Just coffee during Sylvia's lunch hour, because she had limited time and no patience for the theatrical preamble of conventional dating. She told him, at the coffee place, directly, "I'm not looking for anything that moves faster than I'm comfortable with, and I'm not willing to pretend my life is less complicated than it is." He said, "That sounds like a reasonable starting position." She said, "It is." They got coffee again the week after that. Spring became summer. Wren learned to grab things and did not let go of them, which Sylvia found both biologically impressive and personally relatable. Geraldine taught Wren to bat at a hanging mobile and reported this to Sylvia with the same gravity she might use to announce a scientific discovery. Sylvia's mother came back in July, staying for 2 weeks this time, and she met Jonah once, briefly, at a Sunday dinner that Sylvia kept deliberately casual. After he left, her mother washed dishes for a few minutes without saying anything. Then she said, "He looks at you like he's listening." Sylvia dried a glass. "Most people look at people when they talk. Not like that," her mother said. Sylvia put the glass away. She did not think of herself as someone who had been saved. That framing had never felt right to her. The idea that survival required rescue, that the story only made sense if someone arrived to complete it. She thought of herself, instead, as someone who had been in a bad situation and had made very careful decisions, one after another, with the information available to her. And then circumstances had kept going, the way circumstances do, producing both Wren and Geraldine, and Caroline Park and Lorraine Purcell and her mother at the airport, at midnight, and a structural engineer near a drinks table who could negotiate. She had built a good life. It had been damaged. She was building it again, differently this time, with a clearer understanding of the load-bearing walls. On a Tuesday evening in August, she was sitting on her back porch with Wren in her lap when her phone buzzed. It was a text from Jonah. Just a picture, a bird he'd spotted on his run that morning. Small and dark with a white throat patch. Underneath it he had written, "Found a Wren, thought of you." She looked at the picture for a moment. Wren was chewing on her own fist and making an opinion about it. Sylvia typed back, "She approves." A second later, 3 dots, then good. Her opinion is the one that matters. Sylvia put her phone down. The evening was warm. The yard needed mowing. Wren made a sound of deep personal conviction about the fist. Sylvia laughed, a real one, the kind that comes without announcement, and thought, okay, this is how it starts again. And this time she was ready.